Hello, and welcome to the dark room, the place where the shadows come to life and the things that go bump in the night are all too real. Today I'll be your guide through the twisted and terrifying stories that we have in store for you. From spine-chilling urban legends to bone-chilling ghost stories, we'll explore the darkest corners of the human psyche and leave you trembling in fear. So, turn off the lights, grab a blanket, and get ready to enter the dark room. The haunting melodies of the scariest city in Kisisi. Deep in the heart of the African continent lies a small village called Kisisi. It was a peaceful place, surrounded by lush green forests and rolling hills, where the people lived off the land and took pride in their simple way of life. But as the sun set each day, a sense of unease would settle over the village, for just beyond the edge of the forest, there lay a city that the people of Kisisi called the scariest place on earth. The city had once been a thriving metropolis, with towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, but now it was a shadow of its former self. The buildings were crumbling, the streets were empty, and an eerie silence hung over the entire city. No one knew exactly what had happened to the city. Some said it had been cursed by an angry spirit, while others believed it had fallen victim to a terrible plague. But one thing was certain, no one who entered the city ever returned. The people of Kisisi had long ago learned to stay away from the city. They warned their children never to go near it, and they avoided even looking in its direction. But despite their fear, they couldn't help but be drawn to the city's mysterious aura. And so it was that one day, a group of young men from Kisisi decided to venture into the city. They had heard stories of treasure hidden within the crumbling buildings, and they were eager to claim it for themselves. They set out at dawn, making their way through the forest and across the open fields that separated the village from the city. As they approached the city, they could feel their hearts pounding with fear and anticipation. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not a bird chirped nor a leaf rustled in the wind. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. As they walked further into the city, the young men began to notice other strange things. The buildings seemed to loom over them, as if alive, and the streets were strewn with debris and broken glass. It was as if the city had been abandoned in the middle of a disaster. They pressed on, determined to find the treasure they sought. But as they turned a corner, they suddenly heard a low growl. They froze, unsure of what to do next. And then they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before, a creature that seemed to be a mix of man and beast, with fur and teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. The young men knew they had made a grave mistake. They turned and ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the creature was faster, and it chased them through the streets of the city. As they fled, they could hear other creatures joining in the chase, snarling, growling, and snapping at their heels. They ran as fast as they could, but they could feel the creatures closing in on them. Just as they thought they were done for, they spotted a small building ahead of them. It was a dilapidated shack, barely standing, but it was their only hope. They dashed inside, slamming the door shut behind them. For a moment, they were safe, but then they realized that the creatures were still outside, snarling and clawing at the door. They knew they couldn't stay there for long. And then they heard something else, a voice, coming from somewhere within the city. It was a woman's voice, and it was singing a haunting melody that seemed to cut through the darkness. The young men looked at each other, unsure of what to do, but then they realized that they had nothing left to lose. They could either stay and face the creatures, or they could try to find the source of the singing. they decided to take their chances and follow the voice. They opened the door of the shack and cautiously stepped out into the night. The singing grew louder, and they followed it through the twisting streets of the city. As they walked, they could see other creatures lurking in the shadows, but they kept their eyes fixed on the source of the singing. Finally, they reached a small park in the center of the city, and there, sitting on a bench beneath a tree, was a woman. She was the most beautiful woman they had ever seen, with long dark hair and piercing blue eyes. She looked up at them as they approached, and the singing stopped. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. "We're from Kisisi," one of the young men said, his voice shaking. "We came here looking for treasure, but we found something else." The woman nodded, a sad smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I know what you seek," she said, "but there is no treasure here, only death and despair." The young men looked at each other, confused. "Then what is this place?" one of them asked. "This is a city of the dead," the woman said. "Long ago, it was a thriving metropolis, but then a great plague swept through the city, killing everyone who lived here. And now, the spirits of the dead roam the streets, waiting for someone foolish enough to enter." The young men were stunned. They had heard stories of the plague that had devastated the city, but they had never believed them to be true. "But what about you?" one of the young men asked. "How are you still alive?" The woman smiled sadly. "I am not alive," she said. "I died here, just like everyone else, but my spirit could not rest. I am bound to this city, forever singing the songs of the dead." The young men listened in silence, their fears slowly dissipating. They could feel the weight of the city's history bearing down on them, but they also felt a sense of peace. And then, they heard the creatures outside the park, growling and snarling. They knew they had to leave, but they didn't want to leave the woman behind. "Come with us," one of them said. "We'll take you back to Kisisi. Maybe there's a way to help you find rest." The woman smiled, and for a moment, her face seemed to glow with a soft light. "Thank you," she said, "but I cannot leave this place. My spirit is bound here, forever singing the songs of the dead." And with that, she began to sing again. It was a haunting melody, full of sadness and longing, but also of hope. The young men listened for a moment, then turned and ran back to Kisisi. They never spoke of their experience in the scariest city again, but they knew that they had been changed forever. And the woman continued to sing, her voice echoing through the empty streets of the city, a reminder of all that had been lost, and all that could still be found. Years passed, and the young men grew old. They had families of their own and grandchildren who would gather around them and listen to their stories, but they never forgot the scariest city in Kisisi. As time went on, more and more people from Kisisi began to venture into the city. Some were looking for treasure, like the young men had been, while others were simply curious. But they all came back with stories of the creatures that roamed the streets and the haunting singing of the woman in the park. Despite the dangers, people continued to explore the city. Some even set up camps on the outskirts, hoping to find a way to break the curse that had befallen the city. But no one ever found a way to help the woman find rest, and the creatures continued to prowl the streets. As more and more people came to the city, it began to change. Buildings that had been empty for centuries were repaired and reoccupied. New shops and restaurants opened, and soon the scariest city was no longer scary at all. In fact, it became a popular destination for tourists from all over the world. They would come to see the ruins and to hear the haunting singing of the woman in the park. Some even claimed to have seen her, sitting on the bench beneath the tree, her face glowing with a soft light. But despite the changes, the city never forgot its past. Every year, on the anniversary of the plague that had killed so many, the people of Kisisi would gather in the park to honor the dead. They would light candles and sing songs, and for one night, the scariest city would become a place of peace and remembrance. And the woman singing would be the most beautiful of all, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is always hope. The years passed, and the scariest city became a place of legend, a place that people would tell stories about around the campfire. But for those who had lived through the experience, it was more than just a story. It was a part of their lives, a memory that would stay with them until the end of their days. And so, when the young men who had first discovered the scariest city were on their deathbeds, they asked to be taken back there one last time. Their families thought they were crazy, but they granted their wishes, and so they were carried back to the city they had once feared so much. The city had changed once again, and now it was a bustling metropolis, with tall buildings and bright lights. But the young men could still see the remnants of the past, the ruins and the empty streets that had once been filled with creatures.